something, but I want to tell you that, the whole world thought that Russia will be crushed on different small states like the Soviet Union. And of course, I want to say that our state was just in such conditions that it could be true. But Mr. Putin made everything to make real centralization and a lot of different things which were needed first of all. And now there are a program of Mr. Putin, and corruption, the fight against corruption is on the first place. Maybe some of people, some of Russians are tired because the same face, the same politician in Russia, and of course a lot of people really wanted to see maybe new politicians here, but democracy in Russia is very young, and democratic politicians now are formed in Russia, and maybe now we don't see the alternative to Mr. Putin, the really authoritative politician, and there are no such as Putin now in Russia.
Just a reminder, you're listening to The Voice of Russia with me, Scott Craig. And today I'm discussing the weekend's protests in Russia with my guests, Nicu Popescu and Alyona Arshinina. Nicu Popescu, Alyona Arshinina raises the point there of Russia being a young democracy. It's often called a managed democracy as well. Is what we're looking at with these protests part of a genuine political change in the country, or is it an evolution in Russia's democratic system that has the potential to actually lead to democratic development there?
I completely agree that becoming a democracy is a very difficult process. It takes decades. It's very painful. It's difficult economically. You often have clashes, and lots of people often die in this process of the emergence of democracies. This is how it happened in the West. This is how it happens in Asia, in Africa, everywhere. But I think what matters here is that all countries have to go through this process, but they have to move towards greater democracy and greater pluralism if they want to build a sustainable political system. And I think many of the questions related to Vladimir Putin's presidency were the fact that Russia wasn't moving in that direction. No one says it is easy, but the problem was that with Putin's political system, it was moving in many ways in the opposite direction, not trusting the Russian people to elect governors, not trusting the Russian people to have access to free media, not trusting the Russian people to go on the streets and protest. Let's not forget that in the last 2 months, it's the first time in the last few years when protests were not dispersed and beaten by the police. And to be frank, I understand that this is a very slow process, but I don't see any reason as to why the citizens of Botswana, which is a democracy, are more mature than the Russian citizens. I don't see why Indonesians can have democracy and pluralism and Russians cannot. On the contrary, I think the degree of education, the degree of prosperity in Russia is greater. You have more educated people. It's more urban society, a more sophisticated society than Botswana, than Tunisia, than Indonesia. And it is strange that today Russia has a more centralized political system than many of the third world countries, which is very regrettable. I don't believe Russians are not ready for democracy, and it will be a complicated process. The same goes for fighting corruption. It is true that all countries have corruption in the world, but it's also true that the degree of corruption is very different. So if you go to corruption perception index like the Transparency International, you would see that Russia is more corrupt. And it's the judgment of Russian citizens, not foreign organizations. The corruption perception index is based on opinion polls inside these countries. So Russian citizens think that Russia is more corrupt than the citizens of Georgia think about Georgia, than Kazakhstan, than Armenia, than Moldova, than Ukraine, than Tunisia, than Egypt before the Arab Spring. And it is very regrettable that Russian citizens are voting against the degree of corruption they see inside Russia.
We're nearly out of time, but a couple of remaining questions. Alyona Arshinina, just briefly, if you could, do you think the media coverage, particularly state media coverage of the protests in Russia, has been fair? For example, on the first channel, Russia 1, it's Sunday's broadcast spent a very long time talking about the pro-Putin rally and sort of glossed over, in a sense, the opposition protests. Do you think their coverage in the media has been fair?
Before presidential elections, before presidential campaign, we couldn't have an opportunity to see, for example, the not systematical opposition. I mean, such people as Chirikova, Navalny, and Nemtsov, Kasyanov, Ryzhkov, and so on the first channel. But now I can see them. I can listen to their interviews and something. So I can tell you that something has changed. Now we see not only opposition which is sitting in Duma. So parliamentarian opposition on the first and federal programs. But we see and such people who could only dream about first channel, about these federal programs.
So you're confident that the election on March 4th will be conducted fairly?
I'm very interested in it. So that's why I won't see the reason to support Mr. Putin, because I'm a young woman and I want to live in this country and I want to see here the democracy. Now I'm a co-thinker of Mr. Putin, and I want him to do everything he promised, and I really want to see elections to be fair.
Nicu Popescu, we're nearly out of time, but I mean, these protests, obviously, that we've seen began over alleged vote rigging in the parliamentary elections. Do you share Alyona Arshinina's confidence that the conduct of the presidential election will be fair?
I don't fully share it for one very simple reason. Putin is torn between two conflicting aims. One is to have elections which will be counted in a relatively acceptable manner, but his other strong desire is to win from the first round of elections. He himself said just probably yesterday or a couple of days ago that if there will be a second round of elections, this will mean a certain destabilization of the situation. And I don't think this is the way second election rounds work in democracies. It's okay to have second rounds of elections. It doesn't mean lack of stability. It means it's a normal political process. So I think that Putin is torn between the desire to win from the first round, get more than 50% of the vote, and the desire to have relatively acceptable elections.
In terms of the media coverage, have the media been fair on the question of the protests?
I think it depends on what kind of media. To begin with, there is no federal level, pan-Russia TV channels which are not integrated in Putin's vertical of power. So there is practically no pluralism on a national level. There are local radio stations, some TV stations. So what we see today is true that the news at the main Russian TV channels were relatively fair. They were fairer and more correct than any time in the last few years when they were covering this protest. However, the problem is that this is completely not sustainable. It's not embedded in any legal or institutional sense. It basically means that someone decided in the Kremlin to call the heads of the TV channels and say, look, it is okay for now or 2 weeks or 2 months or 2 years, we don't know. It's okay to invite some opposition people. But then this relative openness can be revoked anytime by a simple phone call. So I think what Russia needs today is not this arbitrary use of, turn off, turn on pluralism at TV, but Russia needs strong institutions, an institutionalized system of political pluralism, where the degree of openness of this or that TV channel doesn't depend on the latest mood and the latest calculation of a bureaucrat.
I'm afraid we have to leave it there. We're out of time. But my thanks today to my guests, Nicu Popescu from the European Council of Foreign Relations, and to Alyona Arshinina, who's co-chair of the Young Guard of the United Russia Party. This is The Voice of Russia with me, Scott Craig. Stay with us.